Hey there, Jay here. I have a couple of announcements. First, this is a last call for my live events in Manchester, England and Dublin, Ireland. And if you wanted to come, but felt like you couldn't commit to a whole weekend, I want to let you know that I opened up more registration options. We still have some space left, so I made it possible for people to register for just one day or one session. If you can make it, I'd love to see you there. Also, I have a new teacher training group starting soon. And if neither of those are for you, but you still want to connect with me, there are lots of other ways for us to do that. Best thing you could do is go to my website and subscribe to my free email list. You can find everything, the live events, the teacher training, and all the rest at jbrownyoga.com. All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you if you're new. Everybody else, what's up? How are we doing? How are we holding up against the onslaught of frightening news? Maybe you're not paying attention to it. It's probably a good decision, but certainly seems scary out there. And how we are holding up in the face of all of those external pressures and perceptions. That's really what yoga's about, I would say, right? I mean, it certainly needs to be more about how we're doing on the day-to-day than being able to translate some particular sloka or all of my highfalutin conversations that I have here on the show about non-duality and Atman and Brahman. You know, if you've been around, you know I've been getting into it sometimes, but it all basically comes down to like how you're doing. How are you managing? How are you meeting the challenges that life puts before you? I sure hope that it's not getting the best of you. And it is also my hope that the conversations that I'm having here on this show, even the highfalutin ones about the philosophy stuff, could potentially play into the actuality of things. And I am very happy that my guest today, David McGrath, is exactly about that very thing. He wrote a book called The Yogi's Way, Living in Accord with the Yamas and Niyamas. And I will say, as you'll hear, I tell David at the beginning, he had a wonderful way of doing that. It's not an easy thing to write a book about the Yamas and Niyamas, and he did it in a way that seemed to me geared towards what I was just talking about it being a real thing in your life, not just a concept that you're thinking about, but that you actualize these things in your person. And I think that's a perfect place for us to be. I was super happy to have had this chance to talk with David, and it's a pleasure that I get to bring it to you today. Other than that, I think we're good. I don't really think I have anything else we need to talk about. You know that if you want to connect with me, there's a bunch of ways to do that. And I've got a few things that I wanted to mention, but I think that I will touch base with you on the other side, and we'll save it till then. For now, I think we'll just keep this short and sweet, and we will get to it. Let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with David McGrath. Hello?
Jay, how are you?
I'm good. Hi, David. Nice to meet you.
Likewise. And here we are meeting. I thought there might be an occasion where we'd just be speaking without the visual.
Well, yours came on, so I turned mine on. It's up to you. I'm happy to have it either way. You know, some people prefer not to have the visuals on. I think some people become more accustomed to it and like the visuals. So I'm agnostic on the question. So it's up to you. If you'd like to keep them on, we can keep them on. If you want to turn them off, we can turn them off.
Well, now that we have them, I think we can stick with them. If the
Sounds
quality of the reception deteriorates, or for whatever reason we need to, that's okay. We can reassess.
I think it'll be okay. They've got it figured out mostly. And I'm already recording. I'd like us to kind of consider having already begun. I might edit out a little bit of the banter, but just so you know, I'd like to consider us having just begun, and I don't do like a whole formal beginning like some other folks do.
That's all right. You know, being from Ireland, banter and the kind of soft entry into what might be a very deep conversation is kind of the law of the land.
I had a feeling that you could appreciate that because of what I observed from getting a chance to look at your book, which we'll talk about today. Yeah. But I just really appreciate you taking up the invitation. So thank you for doing this.
Well, for me, it was quite a surprise to receive your email and to see that an invitation to speak on a podcast as opposed to requesting to speak on a podcast. It's a nice turnaround.
I understand how that is. Well, we should thank someone. Unfortunately, I don't have the person's name. What happens is sometimes listeners of this show will send me an email after listening to a conversation I've had, and they'll say, Jay, I think this is somebody you would really like to talk to because of what you're talking about in this podcast or whatever. Yeah. And I usually, I make a note into like a file that I have for it, and then I file away the email, but for some reason I can't find the email. So I don't know the person's name, who it is, but I imagine they're listening to this right now. And I want to thank them because I always appreciate it when listeners contribute to the conversations I'm having here, because they've a lot of them have come to know me really well, and they know like what I get most excited to talk about. So they often have the best recommendations. So thanks to whoever that person was.
Absolutely.
And, you know, it was pretty clear to me why the listener thought that it would be good for me to talk to you, because you were approaching, like you said, challenging conversations in a certain sort of thoughtful way, and you were finding ways to articulate what are often very difficult to articulate concepts. And so with all of that said, again, thank you for your time today. And I guess before we get into everything, I want to also just give you a compliment, because I think there's nothing that I can think of that is more courageous than to write a book about the sutras. I think it's a really bold undertaking. And, you know, as someone who's been a passionate student of yoga for many years, I've hosted this show for 8 years now. I've had occasion to read a fair many books about the sutras and specifically Yamas and Niyamas as well. And I did think that there was something very unique about what you did, and I really appreciated it. So I just wanted to say that to you. I think that's a very significant thing. I want to compliment you on that, because you attempted to broach a consideration of Yamas and Niyamas in a way that I think was really pointing people to an actualization of it, or an actuality of it, rather than just like a thinking conceptual academic idea of it.
Yeah.
Even in the way that you structured it, which we could talk about today.
Yeah.
But before we get into all of that, another thing that I have observed in talking to a lot of different people about source texts or philosophical concepts is that the philosophical viewpoint of whoever is commenting colors whatever it is. Like I've had people come on to like debate the meaning of the word Narodaha, you know, and depending on which one you pick, you can get a pretty different idea about what that sutra is saying.
Yes. Yeah.
So I am always interested to kind of, you know where your influences are coming from. And in getting ready to talk to you, I came across a name that I honestly hadn't heard of before. I didn't know of Roy Eugene Davis before.
Okay.
I've certainly had people on the show who have practiced within like the Self-Realization Fellowship, and plenty of people have referenced Autobiography of a Yogi over the years.
Yeah.
But I hadn't heard of Roy before. So maybe you could say a little something about who he was and then how you discovered him and ended up studying with him.
Absolutely. I think that's a good starting point. Roy Eugene Davis would be who I would consider my main teacher, and the teacher who was most present for me as I embarked upon the path of yoga, specifically Kriya Yoga, and who remained a constant throughout my life until his passing 4 years ago. And he himself was a direct disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. And so when he was 18 years old, he went to SRF, the Mount Washington headquarters, and met with Yogananda, and received instruction in Kriya Yoga, and lived there for, he lived within Washington, within the headquarters for a smaller amount of time. He lived for a longer period of time in Arizona, I believe, where he was still under the guidance of Paramahansa Yogananda. He used to go every month for personal meetings with Paramahansa Yogananda, but was always in communication with him. But Roy was quite young at the time. He was 18, as I said, when he started out.
He was from Ohio, right?
He was. He's
kid from Ohio following Yogananda?
Yeah. And I don't know much, I've gathered more and more insight into the culture in the United States from having been over to Roy's Center for Spiritual Awareness, several times. But otherwise, I would have had an Irish perspective on what the US was, and an Irish perspective on what it meant to be growing up in the US in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. But I can only imagine, I think Roy's background was he was a farm boy. He kind of lived within a rural setting. He lost his mother quite young. He had near death illness at a young age. All of these things, formed the, I suppose, backdrop to his eventually coming across the Autobiography of a Yogi, and then seeking out Yogananda and making that journey from Ohio to Mount Washington, which, from what I know of the United States geographically, that's quite a trip, even, nowadays. So, yeah.
Well, I think there was certainly a strain. I've heard this story on the show many times of folks. He might be a little bit earlier, even like the 60s for sure, where going and finding your guru was the thing that you would do if you became interested in Eastern spirituality.
Yeah.
So the fact that he could find access to one, and like you would go, I probably would have too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, he has a book on this experiences. Roy was very focused on sticking to the teaching and offering instruction on the teaching and guiding people in the teaching, as opposed to getting into all his personal experiences and all of its ins and outs of his own life. But he did share the story sometimes, and he has a book titled Paramahansa Yogananda as I Knew Him, where he talks about that journey from Ohio. I think he ended up in Florida for a while and then made his way out.
Like west. Him eating cornflakes or whatever, right?
Yeah. The little details, the nuts and bolts of what it actually takes to get there. Yeah. And for me, I suppose it was something similar. Well, when I say similar, a 2000s version of that. I read the Autobiography of Yogi. I suppose how that came about, I could talk about, but just to stay on this phase of the chat. And after having read it, I did my research into where I could receive instruction into Kriya Yoga. And, I think the hype for most people after reading the Autobiography of Yogi is, well, how do you do this pranayama breathing technique? How do I do this? How do I...
Seems like good stuff. How do I get in on it?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I want. And so I did some research. I was living in Spain at the time, and I came across Roy's center. And a bit like you stated when your email to me was, I'm a teacher who likes to keep a low profile. I had a little chuckle at that, because I'm kind of getting back into offering instruction and working with people.
I only said that because whoever it was that I don't know, somebody who, like I said, reached out to me and mentioned you. They knew who you were, but I didn't know who you were. So I was like, well, he keeps it kind of low profile. I haven't heard of him before, but seems like he knows what he's talking about. So that's what I meant.
Very good. Yeah. Well, Roy, from my point of view, was keeping a low profile, as compared to SRF. Who had kind of a protocol on how you would go about receiving instruction in Kriya Yoga.
So is there a distinction to be made between what Roy was teaching and SRF?
In the teaching itself, it was very much grounded in what Yogananda taught. But as an organization, they were two different organizations, yeah.
I see. And were they friendly organizations? I mean, I just know how these things can go when there's splits within traditions, sort of,
As organizations, we can look at the entity of the organization. You might say, well, they might have had a bit of friction between them, but between members within organizations, Roy had a good relationship with Sri Dayamata was the president for the time that Roy was, alive and leading Center for Spiritual Awareness. So they had a good relationship between the two of them. And Roy would have been in her presence because she was with Yogananda continuously from a young age. So, yeah.
Do you think it was, like I've heard in many traditions, where there was sort of the earliest adopters, the earliest students, and then things do kind of scale and get bigger? And so there's sometimes those those first generation who had got their certification before there was certification or whatever and all that stuff.
I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head. Paramahansa Yogananda was not an organization. He was an individual who did things as he was inspired to do things. And Roy received, authorization to teach and go on and share the teachings under that. But then later with his passing, things changed and structures are brought into an organization. And so things can kind of, tensions, I suppose, can arise on what's the best way for things to be done and not done. But I think overall, the two organizations navigated their way very well. Roy kept a low key, the term we've used, and he was very much just about fulfilling what his teacher had asked of him, was just to share the teachings with other people and to initiate people into Kriya Yoga and give them the support that they needed. And that's what I got from him. As an organization, it didn't grow into anything, as you said, you've been doing this podcast for several years, I'm imagining, at this point.
8+ at this point. So it's been a while.
And you've never come across his name, and you've had some names on here. But it's not because I don't think Roy didn't have a relevant part to play. I think it's just...
He's got a Wikipedia page, so it's not like nobody knows who he is.
Somebody took the time to write that up, yeah. Yeah, he deserved that.
Yeah. I mean, it's there. I was like, what? So that's one of the things I love about doing this show, is it's an opportunity for me to learn about folks I might not have come across. So
yeah. Well, and for me too, Jay, because I to be honest, I had no idea who you were up until
beautiful.
I got your email.
I love that. That's good. That's better. Well, I guess I'm curious first, beyond wanting to learn pranayama techniques, at the time when you read Autobiography of a Yogi, what was it what you were looking for? Did you want to become realized? Did your idea of what that means change over the years? Or, how much of what your initial inspiration coming in has been, I don't know. Well, what was the initial inspiration?
Well, I think when you talk about stuff changing over the years, the way I'm going to answer this question has definitely changed over the years. The narrative around it is that, I grew up Catholic, Christian within Ireland. I had a very strong devotion to God growing up. When I look back, I could almost say it might have been superstitious in certain ways. He was definitely a fatherly figure with that kind of presence, and someone that I would call out to and talk to and different things like that. But it was my own, I suppose, psychological relationship with this authority that I had grown up to know. And then living in Spain, I came across meditation through a Buddhist school that was in Spain when I was living there. I didn't have much interaction. It was all in Spanish. A lot of it was over my head, but I got familiar with meditation and I started my own practice. And then I did the Camino de Santiago across the north of Spain. So that would have been back in 2003. And I met a man there who was a devotee of Sri Aurobindo. And the Camino de Santiago, you may have had guests who've talked about that on their podcast, but basically it's like a mini lifetime. And I had what I thought at the time, the misfortune of hurting some of my toes, and I wasn't able to walk with the kind of determination that I had started out walking. But this man from Texas, actually, originally, he stayed with me. I was walking sometimes just 5 kilometers a day, very slowly. But he stayed with me, and we walked together for about 10 days, and he planted the seed of yoga well and truly into my mind. He talked.
Wait a second, I have to stop you. I don't know what you're talking about. This like walking for days and days. What are we referring to? I don't think I know what you're talking about.
Maybe it's a European thing. Yeah. So there's this walk across the north of Spain called the Camino de Santiago, which is basically it falls right under the Milky Way in terms of, if we think back to astrological fixtures, it aligns itself with the Milky Way. Mm-hmm. But during the medieval times, it was kind of set up as a path of penance where people, including thieves and all kinds of outcasts, would be so told to walk this path as a way of redeeming themselves. But it also attracted a lot of artists and different people who just wanted to show their devotion to God. And the walk is said to have started in Rome, and then people would make their way up to the north of Italy, cross over into Spain, and then walk from the Pyrenees, and then walk across the north of Spain over to the west side, the end of the world. Finisterre would be the final point. But Santiago is the city where the Christian pilgrims would have ended, where the church is and everything. And it takes, anywhere between, depending on how fast you're walking. If you start from Roncesvalles, if you start from that town in the Pyrenees, it could take you 4 to 5 weeks to walk to Santiago. So yeah, it's well worth the trip. Since then.
But I'm just saying it takes a certain kind of drive, a certain kind of something that makes someone undertake such a thing,
Yeah, I think for me, it was a drive to know something, a drive to, I think, to overcome, or maybe override, it might be a better way, override my own deficiencies or my own sense of not being who I wanted to be. And, we can talk about it in terms of ego and in terms of ourselves as the witnessing presence. But I think at that point, it's safe for me to say I was very much caught up in my ego perspective of things. And I think there was just a sense of, I have a lot of clutter. There's a lot within me. Naming it is not easy, but I need some kind of help to work through it. I think that would be a kind of a clear-cut way of describing it. And then just trusting that there's these different paths that people are doing, but I had tried out Buddhism. I tried out Vipassana. It's very dry for me. At that time, it was very dry. Whereas the way Yogananda was talking about in the autobiography of Yogi was very passionate, very devotional, very mystical. And all of that resonated with that aspect of me at that time. So, there was a kind of, I'm able to talk about it now from that point of view. At the time, it would have been maybe, just realization. I want to have it all figured out,
And I'll learn those techniques. I'll become enlightened. I had that whole thing of like, if I just do all the 8 limbs, then I'll get to the samadhi, or whatever.
I think that's it. It's a quest for perfection. Yeah. A quest to be like, the common expression, being the best version of yourself, but being the ultimate, perfected, most magnificent version of yourself. And I think I was in there. But as I continue, you kind of realize,
life
that self
tends
that we're
to put you in your place as the years go on, doesn't it?
Well, exactly. But also that self that we're talking about isn't the self that is actually going to be perfect. It's kind of like mixing up to the ideas of the self that we're talking about. But definitely life slapped me around a few times since then to kind of get me on the straight and narrow.
All right. Does the reading of the book and the walk coincide? And how do you end up meeting Roy, or what's it like to meet him?
Yeah, well, you have to be careful with me, all right? Because I'm Irish and I can tell stories, and I know that there might be a time frame on this.
It's good. I'm looking for them. We've got time. We'll get to the sutra stuff. I promise.
Oh, okay. There's no worries. Yeah. So after I'd finished the walk, I was kind of living a young and free lifestyle when I was 23, 24, and Don, who I had met on the walk, who had spoken to me about the philosophy and practice and principles of yoga, he said, if you come across the book, The Autobiography of a Yogi, read it. That's the book that's going to help you. And so I ordered it from Santa that Christmas. I read it, and after that I was inspired, I suppose is the word. And so I got researching, found Roy, sent him an email. He sent me an email back, and then he offered to send me over some literature of his, some small booklets and different things, small publications. I got those, and I was in correspondence with him after that, and he sent me on bigger books. One of the books, which is very useful and still available, is the 7 Lessons in Conscious Living. And that has a lot of just the nuts and bolts of yoga principles. And then it also has meditation techniques, practices. So I was, that book I read over and over and over. And then there was other books he sent me to, and we were still in correspondence via email. But it wasn't until 2008 that I was finally able to go to CSA. I had in my mind the notion that I needed to go to India, as so many of us who embark on the yoga path.
I did. I went. Everybody thinks they got to make their Mecca, but I thought I would maybe find a guru, but I did not.
Yeah, so, yeah. It's the romantic notions. Visiting India is definitely wonderful, a useful life experience. What it was for me, it's very insightful. But I think before I could meet Roy, it was kind of like, no, but I need to go to India. So I had a whole other tangent, which was pre-planned, to be honest. It was before I even began correspondence with Roy. But
it's significant. I will just say that, sorry to interrupt, but
that's okay.
My trip to India, I think, taught me more about yoga than a lot of like the yoga training I did. Like just being there and experiencing time in the culture on its own terms was quite a deep lesson in yoga in and of itself, I found.
Well, I've traveled a bit. I've lived in different countries, and I think it doesn't necessarily need to be India that's going to teach you.
That's true. Anytime you remove yourself from your normal identifiers and put yourself, the only thing left is you without all the identifiers.
Yeah.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I had actually spent 1 year living in Thailand before I ended up in India. And that, that's, it stretches you beyond your cultural comfort zone, I suppose. It's sort of what you're saying, just taking you out of everything that you know to be what's going to reflect back to you who you are. All those things are gone.
Especially when you're immersing yourself there, which I imagine a lot of those cultures, and I've talked about in the show, they're very animistic cultures. They have demons, and you can talk to your ancestors, and they have all kinds of stuff that isn't necessarily part of our Western frame.
I remember watching TV shows, there was a place I used to like to eat, and you'd be watching just, 6 o'clock viewing some soap opera, but the paranormal would be included into it. It was just, there would be stuff going on that wouldn't take part in our average drama soap operas,
That's right. That's more baked into those cultures.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because I do think, and I've talked about this on the show as well, yoga traditions and Eastern spiritual traditions were born out of a time where that's the way that human beings were in relationship to the world and the environment.
Yeah.
And in sort of the modern expression of yoga, a lot of that aspect's been left out.
Yeah.
But certainly there.
Just that kind of line, if we're talking about reality and where does it start and where does it end and what is reality, I definitely learned from living within Thai culture and then from visiting India that there's no real need to get into arguing about what is myth and what is history, because ultimately, it's our reflections on the past. They are what we make them, it's kind of
true. Yeah. Very true. I think that's very true. So I guess I'm curious, in your study with Roy, especially when you got a chance to meet him in person, did that take the form primarily of like learning techniques, or was there quite a bit of discussion about philosophy as well? What did the actuality of practicing and studying with him look like?
Well, just to preface to it, like I had imagined that it was going to be like Yogananda with Sri Yukteswar. If you're familiar with the autobiography of Yogi, there's this lovely bond, this immediate kind of bond, and then Sri Yukteswar almost becomes a father figure within Yogananda's life. There's an intimate relationship. It wasn't like that with Roy. I had a sense from the beginning that this man speaks the truth. I'd read a lot of his literature. I knew he wasn't going to be bullshitting me or messing me around. And his organization, it was earnest in the way it was going about helping people. So when I met him, I had arrived in his Center for Spiritual Awareness outside of any formal retreats. So I was there on my own. It's 11 acres. I was there on my own. Roy didn't actually live there himself. He had his own house somewhere else. So it was a very, I suppose, inspiring experience just to be within the grounds and then to have a temple where there's these lineage of masters who I have a familiarity with through the readings and everything. But to be in a setting which is kind of all geared towards your receiving instruction as a continuation of that lineage, there's something very powerful to it. And so when at the beginning, I was just kind of left to get myself settled and to just do my own meditation routine. Roy knew I had a meditation routine. We had been in correspondence, so I just did that. And then there was some time was taken to offer instruction on the Kriya Yoga pranayama breathing technique. My initiation into Kriya Yoga was very informal. I got instruction on the technique, and then Roy offered his blessing, and that was it pretty much. There was room and space for me to ask questions, but there was I suppose it would be a fellow brother disciple of mine, but he was quite a few years older than me, and he had worked with Roy continuously for decades within Center for Spiritual Awareness. And he actually passed away sometime, just 1 or 2 years after Roy. His name was Ron Linden. And I spent quite a lot of time with Ron. So there was a lot that Ron shared with me too, which I could consider to have been of great benefit. And of significance. And then, there was formal retreats where people would come for week-long Kriya Yoga meditation initiation retreats. And I took part in those, and Roy would just offer the teaching in a kind of very systematic, structured way. He was getting older, so he didn't teach the whole day. He taught for a period of time in the morning, and then usually Ron or somebody else would teach in the afternoon. So I received instruction with everybody else. I suppose the difference is that because I stayed on the grounds for an extended period of time, I usually stayed for summers, and I would have the opportunity to meet Roy probably not every week, maybe every week or 2 weeks, depending. And sometimes I'd have lunch and different things. So I think what really was helpful for me was just the kind of nurturing environment where I was able to see people who were all committed to living in a way which was conducive to their just getting rid of the bullshit, and giving themselves some space to allow life to flow through them and to express in a way which is a demonstration of oneness, and I think that was quite inspirational for me. Yeah.
Yeah, having a model for somebody who's
Absolutely.
attuned in that way is pretty key. If you've never met anybody like that, you wouldn't know it was possible.
And that's the thing. When you sat in Roy's company, you got that. You just got that wave, that rush, where you had no choice but to be part of that oneness. It was quite something.
Beautiful. Well, when you weren't there for the summers, did you have like another dual life in a profession to pay your rent or something like that?
I still do. When I came back, I suppose I hadn't really committed to living in Ireland, but then I did commit. And I trained up to, I had been involved in education for a while, but I trained up to become an art and design teacher within what we call second level education. I think you call it high schools. Mm-hmm. And I did that, and then I ended up working in it for a while, and then there was a bit of meandering, because I could speak fluent Spanish, so I ended up teaching Spanish, and then there's rules and regulations over what you can teach and can't teach, all this kind of stuff, the ins and outs of daily life. But yeah, I did that for a couple of years, and then I ended up I was continuing with my practice, but I ended up just going to India again. There was a kind of a gap where I had ended up working on a government sponsored program with adult refugees, and the budgeting for that, it was around the time of the economical crisis around the world, and so the funding for that was taken, and so I ended up going back to India, and then that kind of threw in another direction into my life, but all the while I continued with my practice, but there was a bit of time before I was able to get things settled again. There was just a bit of, I suppose, motion or upsetting.
Sometimes life just has its own momentum, doesn't it? It just does its own thing. I guess the only other note I noticed from your bio that I was curious about, there was a note about something called, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing it, Lacanian School of Psychoanalysis. What's that? I've never heard of that before. Yeah.
Well, it's brilliant that you just, at this juncture, you just show that in there.
I'm sorry if that's a weird aside, but I'm curious again about influences.
It's definitely an aside, and it's a recent aside for me. So I can go straight with the question first of all, and then I can build up around it. But basically, so there's a French psychiatrist called Jacques Lacan, who reframed a lot of Sigmund Freud's teachings using linguistics. And so he basically provided, with that understanding and through his work that he was doing as a psychiatrist, he came to kind of an approach to working with people so that they can how would I say it, kind of using yoga jargon, but they can basically, that the excitation or the energy or what we might call vritti, the kind of the charge that allows those movements to just rise up continuously at their own will whenever they want, even when we don't want them, a way to kind of work through them so that we're no longer dictated to by them. So now there's a different relationship to all of that. Our personal history doesn't necessarily change. Well, it won't change, but who we are in relationship to it becomes loosened up. And so we have more agency over how we engage with life.
That seems in line with yoga teachings to me.
For me, and it might be some ways, some people might have different perspectives on it. But for me, I was going through my own therapy because, well, I had been involved in yoga for many years, but there's a lot to us as individuals, there's a lot to us. And as good as we are in thinking, oh, well, I'm going to do yoga because then I'm going to be this perfect or better or more figured out person.
I know how to do all the pranayamas.
I know how to do all the pranayamas, which, is stirring up a lot of the deep rooted vrittis, it's really dislodging a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think I did a lot of that. Roy had passed on, and I didn't have a means to navigate a lot of what life was presenting me with. If we talk about tapas, the kind of heat of the challenge of the experience, there was a lot of having to work through stuff, which it was difficult. So I resorted to psychotherapy. But I didn't know that my psychotherapist, because I don't think a lot of people do, there's a lot of people just don't know how to differentiate between counseling, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, all this different disciplines. But I didn't know that he had been psychoanalytically trained. So when we sat down, his approach was pretty much, the way I like to think of it is sometimes that when you go to meet a master, they don't really claim to figure your whole life out, but they're very good at helping you to see the deeper aspects of what's going on. That is, yeah.
They're a good mirror. They got the mirror, the clear mirror, right?
The clear mirror, but they also, they know how to just intercept what you've just said at a point which is crucial for you to be left going, it's uncanny in some ways. And I found that within the psychotherapy that there was just this punctuation of my thought processes in the way I was articulating it, which was leaving me kind of going, okay.
Oh yeah, God, that's right. That's true.
Yeah. And with every time that's that true, or any time there's a kind of this energy within you that kind of gets shifted, and you start to kind of, like we're talking about being in a different culture and having the discomfort of that, you start being almost, well, who am I to me? What's my perspective on myself after having said that, and I'm simplifying a little bit, but it helps. No,
it's a good transition to the book and the sutras, because what I appreciated and what I started by saying today with you about the book is that in my own personal experience, I had like a period of time, good 2 years, I'd say, where I had a very strict seated meditation practice that I made myself do every morning because I wanted to assert discipline. And I think that experience was certainly beneficial in a lot of ways, certainly from a discipline standpoint. I had all kinds of absorptive experiences in those times, and, lived lifetimes in all that time sitting there by myself in this cave in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Yeah. But I would say at the same time, I was not well. I was very lonely. Was really removing myself from my life. And in some ways, those experiences were dislocating me and dislodging me in similar ways that it seemed like you were even referencing. Absolutely. And I didn't have someone kind of guiding me. It was just me asserting this discipline. And in the end, I had one teacher in particular who said to me when I was going to him and saying, I'm doing my meditation, I'm doing everything every day, and I'm still so lonely. What do I do? And the teacher said, you need to stop meditating and go get a girlfriend. And I took it very much to heart. I'm married to her today, and we have 2 children, but at a certain point, practice became about having a life more. And I think that's kind of what I felt from your book more, in particular, the way that it was structured, because it was very sneaky. Like at the beginning, it seemed fair. Oh, this could be some simple guided practice thing. But if you go through it more, and I mean, I had to kind of skim through it because I've only had it for a short time. It's like 138-week program or something like that. Is that right? How many, if you go all the way through it from the beginning and followed it, how many weeks is it?
Well, weeks, I think it's 138. I think you might be right, but it's 2.5 years. Whatever that calculates. Yeah.
And is that on purpose? Is that just how it worked out? Because you go through the sutras many times, you cycle through them again and again over this 2.5 years.
Yeah. Well, just to clarify, I cycled through the Yamas and Niyamas.
Yamas and Niyamas. That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. So the idea is, it's a process I went through myself, and it wasn't that I said, okay, it needs to be 2.5 years. That's the best amount of time. It's just, that's how long it took me. And it felt that well, I can't say exactly that's how long it took me, but it's in and around that length of time. And I thought that if I'm going to share this experience with someone else, then they kind of need to go it their own way. And I was talking to someone recently who's been using the book, and they've made a lot of headway in it. And it's quite nice to see that somebody's actually able to make headway through it, that it actually functions like that. But they kind of said, I feel like I'd be able to write myself around, the Yamas and Niyamas. I feel like my understanding of each one of them is progressively getting deeper and deeper. And in my mind, when I was writing the book, I kind of had, the idea that whoever finishes the book, having done the book, would be in a great position to write their own version of that book. Not because, like you talked at the very beginning, you have people coming on and they can all argue about what Naroda is for hours and hours and hours. But that's pretty much true of every concept. What's love? What's, all these Yamas and Niyamas are just basically concepts, and they've been given to us in a foreign tongue, in a different language. So then we have to translate them. And then we're doing our best to get to grips of what each one actually means for each one of us. But it's all very much, I think, a process of embodying the meaning of the word, as opposed to having an intellectual understanding of the concept. And the book aims to allow whoever's using it to embody what the term is endeavoring to communicate, but not on an intellectual level, but on a very lived experiential level. And so at the end of the book, I think it would make perfect sense for someone to feel like, oh, I think I could do that and come up with their own
that
book.
would be when you've done your job, right? When they don't need you anymore, in a sense.
Yeah, I suppose,
right?
Yeah.
But I would say to that point, I think the beginning of the sections, I don't know what we call them, because they're not like exactly chapters, they're weeks or whatever. But what I like, there was like at the beginning, just like lists of words, like look at this list of words and see which words jump out to you in relationship to this thing. There's much more open in that kind of somatic for your own inquiry way, which I think is what you're talking about. As it goes on, though, you do start to put more commentary, even do some commentary on some of the sutras later on. Yeah.
So I don't especially when it comes to the niyamas, the niyamas focus on our internal work. And like when we talk about that, the samskaras, the karma, whatever, the clogged up aspects of us, which are preventing us from having pure experience of conscious awareness, of beingness. That stuff that's getting in the way, it's layered and it's multi-layered. And so the niyamas, specifically the practice of self-study and through meditation, that is going to require a kind of moving into a space where you're happy to sit and reflect. So the book, when I was writing it, I didn't really think that it had to be limited to people who had already been practicing meditation. There's a lot of people in the world who are interested in yoga for other reasons. And to see a book like that, I wanted it to be accessible, but also be kind of maybe alluring or guiding someone to go deeper in the practice and move into svadhyaya and ishvara pranidhana with more.
And those concepts do require some deep reflection. I think that's what they're inviting. I guess my question I have, based on hearing a lot of different people talk about yamas and niyamas specifically, is that sometimes even I've heard used in an interview the word adherence, like a word like adherence, or like even the kind of paradox of having a book that could potentially feel like these are something you're supposed to like get good at or make happen, as opposed to what I think Roy once said is that it's something that happens like more intuitively. Mm-hmm. And so I've had people sometimes describe yama and niyama not as like prescriptive, like you have to follow this, but more like proscriptive, like this is what it looks like when it happens. And I guess I'm wondering if you fall on one. I think I know the answer, but would you speak to that? Because do you think that when we say you have to follow these or you have to learn them or you have to practice them, sometimes it actually can kind of impede the natural unfolding of them, it seems? Have you seen something similar?
What comes to my mind when you talk about it like that, it's kind of, I was having a discussion with a friend of mine. It's not about concepts, but at the same time, we can use concepts to help us to get to the point when it's not about concepts.
Yes. Well, I would say real quick, for me, that works. I'm a very analytical guy, and I feel like sometimes if I feed that little part of my intellect something, it then shuts up and I can feel it better. But I don't know if that's true for everybody.
True. Like when you sit down and, you're in the first sequence or you're in the second sequence, and the second sequence has the 10, it's got the 5 yamas and niyamas. So that whole sequence is going to be a week to each one of those. And let's say you're on the 3rd week of the second sequence and you're sitting down.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.